Hello everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Microcap Mania. My name is Torin Dove, and here on the Dove Financial Channel, I like to break down microcap stocks. I also like to keep up with current events and kind of make videos related to that. So, I recently in another video mentioned that GameStop was going to be adopting a Bitcoin Treasury strategy. And so, that was kind of the inspiration behind this episode of Microcap Mania, was I wanted to become more educated on Bitcoin Treasury stocks in general, and I happened to stumble upon Semler Scientific, which fits very, very close to the criteria for a microcap. It's around a $325 million market cap right now. But I thought this would be a great chance to kind of do a deep dive, grow my own understanding, learn some, and maybe potentially add to the Microcap Mania portfolio. So without further ado, let's get started in today's episode. What is Semler Scientific? Well, Semler Scientific operates as a medical risk assessment company. The company develops, manufactures, and markets diagnostic and testing products that identify potential risk profile of medical patients. Their primary product is the flow check, which measures arterial blood flow to the extremities, fingers and toes, and quickly and easily in the doctor's office gives an idea of whether or not they're going to be developing PAD, which is something that, if untreated, can be very dangerous. Now, FlowCheck received FDA clearance in 2010, and the company actually began leasing the product in 2011. So the company, Semler Scientific, was founded in 2007 by Dr. Herbert Semler, who created the technology in the flow check and got it patent. And then since the company went public in 2014, and its original offering was valued at $10 million. Now, Dr. Herbert Semler isn't really still that involved with Semler Scientific. Instead, we switch over to Eric Semler, who really kind of brought about the change from this medical company into the Bitcoin Treasury company, Semler Scientific. Now, Eric Semler, just a little bit of background on him, he's the president of TCS Capital Management, and in May 2024, Semler adopted the Bitcoin Treasury strategy under his guidance. So, Eric Semler, a little bit more about him. He contributes his investing style to being a former journalist and a contrarian investor. And as you can tell, with Bitcoin being the company's primary investment, this is something that a contrarian would take, as Bitcoin, while it's in a better spot comparatively than it was a couple years ago in terms of main finance and on Wall Street and how they view Bitcoin, at the time of transitioning into a Bitcoin treasury company and Bitcoin reserve company, it was still a major leap for the team. So Eric, he basically saw this, his dad's creation of a company, Semler Scientific, and while they were generating revenues, they were having problems, as primarily where a lot of their funding ended up coming from was through Medicare and Medicaid, and they get reimbursements through those programs. However, in 2023, they ran into regulatory issues, which was spearheaded by Elizabeth Warren challenging some of the rulings on that. And after they made changes to the Medicare and Medicaid system, there was significantly less money coming in from the reimbursements. And so Eric kind of watched this, and he had a background in being an activist investor and joining boards and trying to make changes in companies that were overlooked by Wall Street. And so he actually joined the board. He joined the board along with Will Chang, and both of them kind of worked together to properly prepare for kind of what direction they wanted to take the company. And at the time they hopped on board, the company was what he considered a zombie company, which is a term that Michael Saylor actually used to describe kind of MicroStrategy and where they were at. So similar, they were successful. They were getting about $50 to $60 million in revenue a year, and they just put it all into cash because in the medical space, there's a lot of risk in how to deploy that capital, especially in smaller market cap companies. They didn't necessarily see the respect from Wall Street that purchasing shares and repurchasing shares would give to a typical larger company. There wasn't major changes there. And then also they considered doing many acquisitions of private companies. But when you try and acquire private companies, there's a lot of risks, there's a lot of unknowns, and they didn't really feel comfortable with that. So one of the ideas they pitched and would end up going with was kind of trying to take the MicroStrategy playbook. Eric Semler became a huge Michael Saylor fan, and so he wanted to kind of adopt the Bitcoin Treasury strategy, and he approached the board with this, and the board was very on board, which is a little bit surprising because a lot of these larger companies, the board might not necessarily be looking at investment opportunities outside of like acquiring companies in the space and in their field of competence, and that's why they were one of the very first adopters of the Bitcoin Treasury strategy. So basically they adopted the strategy, which was really, really eye-opening, as again, they didn't necessarily think the board would be on board with that, just due to the riskiness and the nature of Bitcoin being volatile, but they decided to go 100% all in. They spent the majority of the cash they still had on acquiring Bitcoin, and they immediately faced a big downturn. And this wasn't necessarily the best. In a lot of companies, this would lead to the board arguing and fighting and deciding what to do. But surprisingly, the board handled it really, really well. And it kind of inspired everyone to take the profits that they generated from their business brand of QuantaFlow, which is now FlowCheck, and take all of the excess profits and put them directly back into buying Bitcoin. And a lot of the thesis for why they would just acquire Bitcoin is Eric says that Bitcoin is a suitable replacement to gold, and especially with the younger generation, they're less likely to invest in gold and are more likely to invest in Bitcoin, which replaces many of the issues of investing in gold. Now, in my own personal opinion, I tend to agree with this nature. I'm not really a huge fan of gold in terms of an investment property or an investment at all. It's really underperformed comparatively to even the S&P 500, and it's hard to transfer. A lot of the times when people buy gold now, they're just buying it on the ETFs. They aren't even buying the physical gold. And there's not a lot you can do with gold now that the United States is off of the gold standard. And so Bitcoin tries to kind of replace this. It tries to get rid of any intermediaries. It tries to deal with monetary inflation because, again, there's a finite amount of Bitcoin. There won't be any more created after the 21 million is fully mined. And I kind of tended to agree with a lot of the points that Eric and Michael Saylor both made, and I'm kind of on board with them making this transition. Now, obviously, I've mentioned that MicroStrategy and Semler Scientific a lot, but they are two very different business models currently. We could see Semler Scientific adopt more of a MicroStrategy playbook, but currently Semler Scientific is acquiring Bitcoin through ATM activity and primarily through the earnings of the company and the revenues of the company, whereas MicroStrategy is just issuing and issuing debt and creating more and more shares. So one of the key parts of this investment thesis is actually looking at and valuing it in terms of how well it is to other Bitcoin treasury stocks. It's kind of hard to relate this stock to like stocks in general and how you would take on a typical investment valuation, just because it's a very different business model than a typical company. But I will do a lot of comparison to MicroStrategy moving forward in the rest of this investment video, just kind of to give a little bit of an understanding and a little bit of a clarity as to whether or not it ends up in the Microcap Mania portfolio. Now, I have up on the screen the Bitcoin's holdings as of February 14th, 2025. They currently hold 3,192, and at today's valuation, this is more around 250 million, but that is still 2/3 of the market cap of Semler Scientific, actually a bit more than 2/3 of the market cap. And for a company that small, it really is just a large amount of Bitcoin relative to market cap, which you wouldn't see in a MicroStrategy at this current point. Now again, the revenues 56.3 million for the fiscal year of 2024. This is an actual drop from last year of 68 million, but the way I've kind of viewed Semler Scientific in doing this valuation and research is that the primary purpose of the company is solely around acquiring Bitcoin and maintaining a Bitcoin Treasury strategy. Whereas the actual business that kind of built Semler Scientific is more of just like a backdrop in case anything goes wrong and a way to generate the profits to then reinvest into Bitcoin. Now, walking through kind of like what QuantaFlow is and how that kind of works necessarily is, again, it's the laptop thing. You plug it in, you can like put it on the extremities, so toes and fingers, and it'll actually run the diagnostics for that, and it is, again, FDA cleared. However, they have their patent that's going to be expiring in 2027, so this will be interesting to see whether or not in those 3 years they fully pivot from the medical space and just solely become similar to a micro strategy or like the Bitcoin Treasury, or if they do in fact try and prioritize maintaining some level in the medical field and keeping some level of underlying business. Now, again, this just highlights the primary values of Semler Scientific right now, which is, of course, the Bitcoin Treasury strategy and generating the cash from QuantaFlow to then, of course, purchase future Bitcoin. So we'll see whether or not they really protect QuantaFlow as that patent expires, or kind of what the move is there. A lot of the executive conversations and interviews I watched really don't even highlight the core business all that much. It's primarily built around the Bitcoin Treasury strategy, and so I definitely think that is going to be where they prioritize going in the future. Now, where does this thesis potentially go? It's a core belief of the company that Bitcoin will become increasingly more institutionalized, especially as in recent time the SEC created 11 Bitcoin ETFs, and the US Strategic Bitcoin Reserve was actually recently announced, and then you have major countries throwing large amounts of money to try and become primary holders of Bitcoin. So that'll be really interesting to see moving forward. But I do think there's a bullish outlook on the company, and I tend to have a bullish outlook on the company simply because of the advantages that they have relative to other Bitcoin treasury strategies. Now, these were kind of the important investment metrics I wanted to pull up on screen and just kind of walk through any of the highlights necessarily. But again, this is kind of hard to compare to normal valuations, how I would typically view things in a microcap space, because the company and the primary objective of the company is so different. But as you can see, their market cap of 324.84 million. Again, compare that relative to how much Bitcoin they're holding, which is around 250 million right now. Their income right there doesn't necessarily represent for the revenues of the whole year, but you can see their sales, 56.29 million. Flipping over to the PE ratio, 6.89 is pretty attractive. Price to sales of 5.7, price to book of 1.4. So it is a relatively cheap valuation if you just try and take into account like the actual company of selling the QuantaFlow products and the software with that, and just being a medical company. Again, very little debt, something that's quite different to MicroStrategy, and we'll see kind of if this changes in the future. I honestly expect this to change going forward in the future, but for right now they have almost zero debt, and they can actually undertake some if they want. Now, they have earnings per share of almost $5 per share, and then if you actually look over at who owns these shares that are outstanding, you have a lot of insider ownership, you have a lot of institutional ownership, which I always like to see. It is slightly worrying. I recently saw something that the top 14 shareholders own 50% of the company, like 50% of the shares, and that can be a little bit worrying at times, but I think overall it's really good to see high insider ownership. There have been a lot of transactions recently where insiders, primarily Eric Semler, has been actually acquiring more shares, and I think that's good going forward. Now, something that's really exciting and where I think that they could potentially, if they prioritize a little bit more their current quanta flow and trying to push that, is their actual margins for their products. Again, if you look at the gross margin, they have almost a 91.54% gross margin. That's absolutely absurd. And then shares outstanding. This has actually increased a little bit. They did a ATM push out of $100 million in shares, and or not $100 million in shares. Sorry, that was the debt they pushed out. They did do an ATM though of around $20 million, and then they actually did issue 4.25 interest notes that totaled 100 million. They'll mature in the year 2030. So, again, all in all, this is a company that really intrigues me. I definitely like the Bitcoin Treasury approach for them. I think a lot of these smaller, what would be called zombie companies, will likely adopt this in the future. And personally, I'm all for it. You know, Wall Street's going to overlook a lot of these smaller companies. Like, who's going to be super excited if a Quanta Flow generates more revenue than they did for the past 5 years? And especially in that mid to smaller cap space, a lot of these can be overlooked. And I understand not having anywhere to park the cash. Again, monetary inflation is one of the key points, and just necessarily how much the US prints out year over year. I understand why they would adopt the Bitcoin Treasury strategy. I like it for them. And then looking at the effectiveness, when you look at something like the Bitcoin yield for Semler Scientific, it's jumped to 107%. And basically, that's just kind of an efficiency metric at how efficient they are at acquiring Bitcoin on a per share basis. And if you compare that to a MicroStrategy that's supposed to be the experts, where it's still at like 44%, that's really exciting to kind of get behind. I don't think Semler Scientific will necessarily be the cutting edge of finding Bitcoin uses and kind of creating that. I think more of a MicroStrategy will definitely do that in the future. But I think Semler Scientific is a comfortable option to invest in a company that you think can acquire Bitcoin rather efficiently. And a lot of my investment thesis on this actually kind of boils down to BlackRock, what they put out a year ago almost, as the SEC created the 11 Bitcoin ETFs, that you should actually look at a 2 to 3% allocation into Bitcoin. And personally, I would rather have that be a company that uses profits that they generate to invest in Bitcoin efficiently and can actually add a large position in Bitcoin relative to their market cap, that if anything were to happen in the future with Bitcoin or anything of that nature, they can always fall back onto the company and you have plenty of time to get out of that investment. I mean, obviously, it would still be a sharp fall, but they still have a very profitable business model underneath the Bitcoin Treasury strategy. Whether that continues or not after 2027, we'll have to see. But for me personally, I think this does actually deserve a spot in the Microcap Mania portfolio, and so I'll be looking to add a position into it. It will be a little bit more than 3% just due to the nature of the portfolio itself, starting with the $500, and currently Semler Scientific trades around 30. So we'll see necessarily what percentage that comes out to when I'm actually able to purchase and get a share of it. But overall, I think this is earned a place in the Microcap Mania portfolio. I'm excited to see the future of Semler Scientific, and I think relative to a lot of the public Bitcoin Treasury companies, they're actually really, really efficient, which is exciting to see in a company so small. So thank you for tuning into this episode of Microcap Mania. Again, just because I put a company into my own personal portfolio doesn't necessarily mean you should. Again, all investments carry risk. Do your own research. If you still have the mindset that Bitcoin is absolute crap in the year 2025, this definitely should not be an investment for you, and I applaud you in having that opinion. And I think that's kind of the good thing about investing, is everyone can make different investment decisions. Everyone can invest in completely different things. You can invest in Tesla if you want. I personally won't, but again, that it's kind of open-ended and anyone can do their own thing. But again, don't just follow some guy off of the internet who does something for his own personal portfolio. Make sure to do your own research into this. If you want to kind of follow the BlackRock approach, then 3% allocation is more than enough, or honestly 2 or 1% if it's something that super worries you, or zero. I mean, there's no shame in that whatsoever. Make your own investment opportunities and situations and what you can deal with on a personal level. And I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Thank you.